if you've been with us recently, so we've been going through the book of Daniel, and at chapter 7, Daniel kind of took a turn from narratives and kind of cool stories to now dreams and visions and things like that are a little more, as Sai mentioned, difficult to get into and difficult to figure out. But here we are. So in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel has a vision of a ram and a goat and some things that happen in association with the ram and the goat. And so let's first read the vision. This is one of those passages that gives us the vision and then it gives us the interpretation, which it doesn't always do that. So we're kind of fortunate today that we get the vision and then we get the interpretation of the vision. So let's read the first 14 verses of the vision and then we'll dive into what it all means. It says, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision was the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes, and I saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal, and it had two horns. And both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and he struck the ram and broke the two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it altogether with the regular burnt offerings because of transgression. And it will throw the truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. And then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. All right, anybody confused yet about all of this? There's a lot of symbolism in apocalyptic literature, as you may know, and so we're going to try to unpack some of that today. So I want to give kind of just pay attention to the language that we just read about. There was a ram. Both horns were high, and one horn was higher than the other, right? It kind of elevated language. The ram was charging, and it was charging to the west and the north and the south, and there was no beast that could stand before him. So in this apocalyptic literature, it's painting for us a picture of something that's great. It says no one could be rescued from the power that the ram had. And the ram did as he pleased, and the ram became great. And then we're introduced to a goat, and this goat came from the west, and the goat was going across the earth at such speed that he wasn't even touching the earth, right? You can just imagine just a bolt crossing the face of the earth. And he had this conspicuous horn, and the goat ran at the ram in his powerful wrath, and he was enraged, and he struck the ram, and he broke both horns of the ram. So there's this battle that's going on here that the Bible is trying to portray for us. In a moment, as we get to the interpretation of the vision, we'll unpack who these things represent. But just kind of sit for a minute with this language of what's happening and just the greatness, the awesomeness of what's happening between the ram and the goat and the language that the Bible gives us. As we dive into the interpretation in verse 15, it says, "When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, 'Gabriel, make this man understand the vision.' So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and I fell to my face. But he said to me, 'Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end.' And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and he made me stand up. He said, 'Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end.'" And we'll pause there for just a moment as we consider what's happening to Daniel. So we're told now twice that Daniel is the one writing these words. There is debate among theologians about when the book of Daniel was actually written. Around the 6th century BC during the time of the events, or some place later around the 2nd century BC, years later after some of these events that we're reading about. And one of the arguments for a later writing of Daniel is that he is written about future events in his time, future events from his time with such accuracy that people would say it had to be written after these events happened. There's no way that he could write with such accuracy hundreds of years before some of these things took place. Now, we adhere to Daniel being written around the time of the events in the 6th century BC because we believe that God could do that, right? God could give Daniel a vision like we're reading about future things from his time, and that they could be accurate. And so Daniel is seeking to understand, just like you and I, he's seeking to understand, like, what in the world did I just see? For us, what in the world did we just read? What does this mean? What is it about? And so Daniel is seeking to understand this vision. And someone is standing before him with the appearance of a man. And someone speaks to this man and says, "Gabriel, tell Daniel what this means." Right? God sending his angel Gabriel to unpack for Daniel the interpretation of this vision. And oftentimes when angels appear to people in the Bible, people are pretty frightened, right? We don't know what it is that they've seen exactly, but they're pretty frightened and awestruck. And Daniel said that he was frightened and he fell to his face. And Gabriel tells him that he's going to give him understanding, that this vision is for the time of the end. And one thing that we want to clarify is that when he says the time of the end, he is not talking about the end of all things, right? Daniel chapter 8 is not about the end. Daniel chapter 8 is about the end of a season of persecution, and we'll get to that more here in a moment. But when this angel had spoken, it says that Daniel fell into a deep sleep with his face to the ground, and so he became sort of comatose, maybe, if you will, at this encounter with the angel. And the angel basically wakes him up and pulls him out of his comatose state and says that he's going to make known to him what will be at the latter end of the indignation. And this is what gives us a hint that we're not talking about the end of all things. We're talking about the latter end of the indignation. And again, we'll get into that here more in just a moment. But as we pick it up in verse 20, he says, "As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper, and under his hand, in his own mind, he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome, and I lay sick for some days. And then I rose and I went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. So even in the interpretation given to us, we're still kind of asking the question, what in the world? Like what is going on here? There's lots of imagery and lots of symbols that are mentioned here. Just to give a few definitions, it talks about the host of heaven. And in this instance, the host of heaven is referring to God's people, the saints, those who are followers of God. It talks about the stars, which in this instance I think can also be interpreted as God's people. The prince of the host is probably referring to God himself. And then there's this person called the host, which is probably the high priest of the day. And then the 2,300 evenings and mornings that we have to wrestle with to figure out what that means. Sometimes in the Bible, numbers are symbolic. Sometimes they're not symbolic. And so we have a few different options for these 2,300 mornings and evenings. And so one option could mean that it's 2,300 full days. A lot of times in the Bible, it will say, like there were 40 days and then there were 40 nights. In this case, it doesn't say 2,300 evenings and 2,300 mornings. It just says 2,300 evenings and mornings. So that's a little bit unique in Daniel. It could mean 2,300 half days. Or 1,150 days, depending on how you interpret it, or it could just be straight up symbolic in this instance. And so maybe as we get to the end, we'll have a little better idea of what these 2,300 mornings and evenings mean, but those are three options to consider for what they are. It talks about the time of the end, and again, not the end of all things, but the end of this indignation, as the Bible calls it. Something I think that we can draw from this as we wrestle to interpret what this means is that the fact that there is an appointed end to this indignation, whatever it is, should also inform us that there's an appointed beginning to it. In other words, there's a plan that's unfolding here. One of the things that we've seen throughout our time in Daniel is the sovereign hand of God. You might remember in Daniel chapter 1, just right out of the gate in Daniel chapter 1, that we're told that it was God who allowed them to be taken into captivity, into Babylon, that God allowed it. It wasn't just happenstance. It wasn't just a bad thing that sort of happened outside of God's watch, but that God allowed that to happen. And that pokes at us a little bit. It ruffles our feathers. It steps on our toes to think, why would God allow something like this to happen? The Bible tells us that God's ways are not our ways. His ways are higher than our ways. The Bible tells us that God is an infinite being, and you and I are finite beings. Right? God has no beginning and no end. We have a definite beginning and a definite end. And as finite beings, we're not capable of fully wrapping our minds around and grasping someone who's infinite. Right? We just can't grasp it. Do you ever think about eternity? Usually when we think about eternity, we kind of think of, kind of going forward. Maybe eternity is forward forever, but think about eternity as also forever backwards, right? Blows your mind to think about eternity going forward after us, but also before us, right? We can't grasp that. We're just not meant to grasp it. God in his sovereignty, in his sovereign providence, is doing things that we can't even begin to realize. And it doesn't sit well with us to think that God would allow his people to be taken captive in Babylon. Just like it doesn't set well with us to think that whatever this indignation is, that God allowed it to happen. God allowed this thing to happen. The Bible tells us that it's God who appoints rulers and who appoints authorities. And that's not only true in our present day and who our rulers and our authorities are, but it was true in Daniel's day, as it's been true throughout history, that God, working towards his end, for which we can't fully grasp, He's appointing people in places of power and authority. And sometimes the people in power and authority are good and they do things that are honoring to God. And other times they're not good and they do things that don't honor God, or they do things that are against God. We read in here that that the goat rises up, or the little horn rises up against God himself, right? Thinking so much of himself. But we're also told that it was God who put him in power, right? God put someone in power who ultimately rose up against the one who put him there, right? The height of arrogance. We're told that the ram represents the kingdoms of Media and Persia. We're told that the one-horned goat represents the king of Greece, and at that time, or in the vision, it's referring to Alexander the Great. We're told that those horns were broken, and that the horn was broken, and that 4 horns replaced the one. And history tells us that after Alexander the Great died, that he had 4 generals that divided the kingdom among themselves. So these are the 4 horns that came in the place of the one. We're told that while Alexander the Great was obviously great, his generals did not have the same power and influence and reach that he did. Again, by God's design. And so these generals divided the kingdom after his death, and then out of one of those came a king of bold face. And that's just another way to say that an arrogant king who thought more highly of himself than he ought to. And we know this king to be Antiochus Epiphanes, and this would be about 400 years after the time that we're reading about today in Daniel chapter 8. So Daniel is getting a vision of things that happen way, way in the future, not just a few weeks or a few months or a few years, but way, way in the future. So now that we've got a little bit of a sense here of who the players are and kind of what's happening, we're not going to get into all of the history today of all of this. You, on your own time, can go and be a student of history if you want to learn more about Alexander the Great and all of these kinds of things. But one of the questions that we have to ask is, what did this mean to them then? What did this mean to Daniel and the people of his day as God was giving him this vision for a purpose? And we have to ask the question, what does it mean to us today? Daniel was given a vision predicting future events that he would never see unfold. We're reading about this, knowing a little bit of our history, world history, and knowing these events took place. And so what did it mean to them in their day, and what does it mean to us in our day? And I think to Daniel and the people of his day, this was obviously a foretelling of the future. It was a warning. It was a warning. It talks about in here that the appointed time, that the transgressors would reach their limit, right? That there is a sense in which these things are happening due to God judging the sinfulness of his people. That doesn't set real well with us either. But God is judging the sinfulness of his people. And that's the purpose for this indignation. It's the purpose that there's an appointed end, because the transgressors, it said, would reach their limit. So these 2,300 mornings and evenings, however they're interpreted, have to do with the transgressors reaching their limit. And so this was certainly a warning to those to live in obedience and righteousness and holiness unto the Lord. Also, at the same time, this is of great comfort to know that God is orchestrating these events. Even if it doesn't totally set well with us, that God is orchestrating some bad things. He's orchestrating destruction. He's allowing somebody like Antiochus Epiphanes to come into power. We're told that Antiochus Epiphanes, his power shall be great. It says that he will cause fearful destruction, and he'll succeed in what he does, and he'll destroy mighty men and people who are saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he'll rise up against the Prince of Princes, or God himself. But it's a comfort to know that he was put in power, not by his own power, but by the power of God. And we're told that ultimately he will be broken, but by no human hand. And so who is it that's doing the breaking? It's God. God who's doing the breaking. So God who allowed this man to rise to power, and God who brings this horrible, destructive, deceitful, vengeful reign to an end. And so we should take some comfort to know, even though we can't understand it fully, even though we may not like it, even though we may not agree with it, that God is orchestrating events for our good and for his glory ultimately. We should take comfort in that. So what did it mean to them? It was a warning to them. Certainly it should have been a comfort to them, certainly. But we know if you're a student of your Old Testament, you kind of know the pattern of Israel was that they would for a time maybe come under God's subjection, under his rule and under his authority. Then they would decide to go their own way, and they would reject God, and God would send prophets to tell them you shouldn't be doing this, and then maybe some calamity would happen, and then again they would come under subjection to God's authority for a time, and then they would go their own way. Just kind of the cycle would wash, rinse, repeat. And they didn't always heed the warnings given to them by God. Why God is giving Daniel a vision of events that would happen as far out as 400 years after this time, I don't know. Don't know why God did that, but God did that. It's remarkable that Daniel could record these events with such accuracy so far into the future. And that, again, should give us comfort to know that God is doing a thing here, that God has a plan that's being orchestrated, that's unfolding perfectly according to his plan. There's nothing that's going off of the rails in this plan. What does this mean to us? I think similarly as to what it meant to them, it's a warning for us that God judges sin. God judges the sin of his people. I've said many times before that the good news of the gospel isn't that good if the bad news isn't that bad. And the bad news is that we are all unrighteous sinners. And we have all sinned against a holy and a righteous God. And the bad news is also that there's going to come a reckoning for our sin and our unrighteousness when we stand before God one day and give account for how we've lived, either in obedience to him or in rebellion against him. And the Bible, from beginning to end, shows us that we humans, we're just a rebellious people. It's just who we are, right? We are a rebellious people, and that we can't be good enough, long enough to be accepted by God without outside intervention, something outside of ourselves. And so as we see this vision of Daniel unfold, and then 400 years later for it actually to come to pass, where God judged the sin of his people, we should feel the weight of that. We should sit with the warning of unholy, unrighteous living before a holy and a righteous God. But we should also take comfort that there is a limit to this. Just like God limited the time of judgment to the transgressors to these 2,300 mornings and evenings, that God has a limit to the subjection of his people to their judgment. And God has mercy so that we can turn to him and that we can live under his rule and under his authority in subjection to him, because he's merciful. And if he's the one that causes powers to come and go, whether good or bad, then he's also the one that can forgive sins, and he's the one that can declare the unrighteous to be righteous. We have the benefit that Daniel did not have, or people of his day did not have, of looking back to the cross. Right? We have the benefit of looking back to the cross to see how seriously God takes sin and unrighteousness and unholiness and judgment. So much so, the Bible tells us that it was the will of the Lord to crush his son. That's another thing that doesn't sit real well with us. It was the will of the Lord to crush his son so that his son could take on the sinfulness of all of mankind, yours and mine and the people of Daniel's day and everybody that's lived in all of time and all of history, that he would be able to take on that sin and offer to us a trade, our unrighteousness for his perfection and his righteousness, so that when the reckoning comes and we stand before God, we can say, I'm with Jesus. Right? That's the good news. Right? The bad news is there's a reckoning for sin. The good news is that Jesus has reckoned sin for us. All by God's design and all by God's plan. And so we absolutely should heed the warning, the same warning that Daniel and the people of his day would have had about unrighteous living, but we should also take great comfort that if it's God who is sovereign, if it's God who orders everything, if it's God who's in control, if it's God who is the creator, if it's God who spoke into the nothingness and said, let there be, and then all of a sudden there was, and if it's God who's offering mercy, then we can take advantage of that mercy. And we should take great comfort in that. The other thing this might mean to us is that it's not out of the cards that God's people may suffer. God's people may suffer. And as we're considering, as we go through this, and as the men go through Revelation, we're considering what the end of all things looks like, this throws a wrench in our thinking that maybe the church isn't going to have to go through a tribulation and suffer in some way. This throws a wrench in that thinking because God allowed this to happen. He allowed his people to suffer. So we take the warning, but we also take the comfort in it. Jesus actually referenced Daniel chapter 8 in Matthew 24. It wasn't that long ago we were going through the book of Matthew, so some of you may remember this. Jesus referenced in Matthew 24 the vision of Daniel in chapter 8, talking about the abomination of desolation. And when we taught through Matthew 24, we said that this could be potentially a kind of a dual hill prophecy, a prophecy with two hills, that maybe it meant something in Daniel's day, and maybe it also meant something in Jesus' day, this abomination of desolation, that it could have referred to Antiochus Epiphanes doing the things that we read about here, bringing destruction and desolation. It also could have referred to the destruction of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And we might do well to think that it could also maybe mean something in the future from us that we haven't encountered yet. It's possible. I'm not saying it's a certainty, just saying that it's possible that we Christians, that we followers of Christ, could experience similar things and have to go through similar things. I hope not. I pray not. But we have to acknowledge that it's possible. And in our acknowledging that it's at least possible, we take comfort to know that these things, these difficult things, won't go on forever. Just like in Daniel's day when God limited the time of the destruction of Antiochus Epiphanes, that he's going to limit the time of anything that comes that we may not encounter yet. Because one day, God will redeem all things. We're told that there's going to come a day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, and there will be no question of who he is. And so we can take some comfort that even if we have to go through difficult things and face difficult things as Christians, that God is still in control and God is merciful ultimately to his people. Antiochus Epiphanes would rise, but not by his own power, but by the will of God. And his destruction would come to an end, but not by his own will, but by the will of God. It actually says that his power would be broken by God, that God would be the one doing the breaking of his power. History would tell us that there was a guy named Judas Maccabees. Maybe you've heard of the book of Maccabees. It's not part of the canon of Scripture. But Judas Maccabees, in the 2nd century BC, led a rebellion against Antiochus Epiphanes, and he triumphed. Jerusalem, it tells us, was taken back, and the temple observances were returned. Jews today still celebrate the historic victory won by Judas Maccabees with the observance of Hanukkah. So if you ever wondered what Hanukkah was, that's what Hanukkah is to celebrate. Tradition has it that while the Maccabean revolt was in progress, the burning candle wicks of the menorah remained miraculously lit. So a little Jewish history there that you might find interesting. But for Christians, while we might hold somebody like Judas Maccabees in high regard, it will ultimately be a later deliverer, according to David Helm, who comes into view as the ultimate light of the world. In his early ministry, Helm says that Jesus entered the temple at the time of religious degradation and laid claim on restoring it to its rightful place. In fact, Jesus later proclaimed that he was the light of the world. For Christians, Jesus' substitutionary death and resurrection put an end to the need for morning and evening sacrifices once and for all. For his blood shed once has the power to atone for all when received by faith. And so as we consider these events of Daniel chapter 8 and the vision of Daniel chapter 8, things that we can look back in our history books and read about that actually unfolded that the Bible got right, we heed the warning that God judges sin, but we take the comfort that God is merciful towards sinners. And thankfully, he's merciful. If God was not merciful towards sinners, we would all be in a bad spot. But God is merciful towards sinners. God is sovereign over all. He appoints powers and rulers and authorities. He causes them to come and he causes them to go, all for the purpose of accomplishing his end, his purpose, his will, always unfolds. And Daniel, at the end, was overcome with this vision. It says that he laid sick for some days, so that this just got to him. Have you ever experienced anything that just caused you to just want to lay in bed for days because you can't handle whatever it is that you just found out? This was Daniel. He laid sick for days. But at the end of those days, and we don't know how many days, it just says for some days, but at the end of those days, it says that he rose up and he went about the king's business. If I were Daniel, I might want to find a bunker somewhere or hunker down or kind of, retreat from the world after seeing what I saw. And Daniel, after being down for a few days, just sick over this, it says he got up and went about the king's business. It says that he was appalled by the vision and still didn't fully understand it, but he went about the king's business. So in other words, he went to work. He got up after a few days of being down and sick over this, and he just went to work. And he went about his business. And while this isn't the main point of the text, I think there's something for us to learn here as well. There's a lot of wonky things going on in our world today. Maybe not to this degree, but there's a lot of wonky things going on in our world today, and it's easy to get wrapped up in just the bad things that are going on, and even evil things that are going on. The infighting in our political system is exhausting. It's tiring. There are some days where I just wish, can somebody just come in and fix this? Can somebody come in and just give people a basic lesson in humanity and how to be civil, right? Daniel, after seeing what he saw, experiencing what he experienced, he got up and he went to work. And one thing we know about Daniel this far into the book is that he went to work with his faith fully on display. We know that about Daniel. Right? We've read the stories about Daniel. He went to work in a hostile culture. He was held captive there against his will. Yet he worked hard for the benefit of this hostile kingdom. I don't fully understand this, but he worked hard for the benefit of this fully hostile culture towards him. And sometimes it didn't go well for him and his buddies, right? They experienced difficulty. They experienced persecution because of their faith. But even knowing what Daniel knows after receiving this vision and receiving the interpretation of it, he collected himself, he got up and he went to work and he just went about his business. He went about his business serving a hostile king, but serving ultimately the King of Kings in so doing, right? Daniel wasn't out protesting this or boycotting that. He wasn't trying to, through political means, change his society. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that's not what Daniel did. He continued to faithfully serve his God, trusting that whatever was happening was not outside of the purview of God himself. I think sometimes we forget that. I scratch my head a lot thinking, how in the world can this thing or that thing happen in the world? And I have to remind myself that God's not scratching his head thinking, where in the world did that come from? Or how did that happen? God knows. And maybe even some of the things that are happening are the direct result of God orchestrating a thing happening. But at the end of the day, God's will always be done. There's never an instance anywhere where God's will is not done. ever. God's will always be done. God will always be faithful to who he says he is. The Bible tells us that he can't disown himself, right? So it tells us in Timothy that even when we're faithless, that God remains faithful. God's faithfulness is not predicated upon ours. God is who he says he is, whether we are who we say we are or not. God is merciful. God is all powerful. He's the one that spoke everything into existence out of nothing. He's in control. And so we take comfort in that, and we can get up tomorrow and put one foot in front of the other and go about our business, living faithfully unto God in an ever increasingly hostile culture towards God, because we know these things are true about him. Just like Daniel, going about the king's business, even though we don't fully understand all of it, right? There are things that we're just not capable, like I said earlier, of fully understanding. We understand what God allows us to understand. So my encouragement to us as we consider the vision of Daniel chapter 8 is to be reminded of these things. God judges sin. God is merciful towards sinners. God is all powerful. Nothing happens anywhere outside of his watchful eye. He's working constantly for your good and his glory. Father, we're thankful this morning. These things are true of you, and we're thankful, even though there are things that we don't always understand because your ways are higher than our ways. We're thankful to know that you are working for our good and for your glory. And so I pray that you would help us to remember that. Pray that you would help us to be people who are faithful as we go outside of the walls of the church and engage in the world. That you would help us to be a peculiar people, as the Bible calls us, peculiar in that we live in obedience to you when it's not the popular thing to do. So help us to be people that preach the gospel, not only in the way that we live, but that we would proclaim the gospel in the words that we use as well. Every opportunity that we get with people in a lost and dying world that so desperately need to know you. And we ask it in Christ's name. Amen.